Hi, welcome to the second half of building a container using basic solder joints. So in the last video, we created a frame for our container first, and then we put it together using a butt joint, solder joint. After that, we soldered it to a base material, and we used a right angle joint, and then cut off the excess metal. And so now we have our finished form ready for a lid. So our next step is that we are going to create a tension fit lid and a top for our vessel. I'm actually not going to make as deep of a lid on this one, and so I've pre-cut some strips of material so that our lid shape will be a little bit thinner. First thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of different ways of measuring, and that is going to be for the inside wall of our tension fit lid. There are a couple of ways of figuring out our tension fit lid. All of this is going to be based on circumference. So one of the ways that I'm going to do this is I'm going to measure the diameter. I can do that with my ruler, but sometimes it's kind of hard to see if I'm at halfway point. I could certainly mark off my halfway point and look at it like that. The other thing I can do is I can use calipers, and I have some really great digital calipers here. And so I'm going to measure the inside diameter. So first I make sure it's zeroed out, and then I'm going to measure my inside diameter. So mine is saying 47.31. Make sure that I've got it all the way in the center, right at 47. So I know for sure that I have 47 as one of my measurements. And then another way that I also do this, just as a backup to check and make sure that I have my diameter correct, is that I sometimes will tape that inside edge. And this is giving me the diameter of the inside edge, the inner diameter, or the inner wall diameter. This is also giving me an idea of what that inner diameter is. So again, on my diameter, I'm going to take the diameter of my cylinder, and then I'm actually going to subtract the thickness of the material first. So diameter of the material, which is 47, and then subtract the thickness of material, which mine is 1 millimeter, so that's 46 millimeters, and then 46 millimeters times 3.14, which is roughly 144 millimeters. So again, I'm going to go with my ruler, and I go to 14 centimeters, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, that's my 144. You'll probably have to play around a little bit with your equation as to how much you want to subtract, and since I'm using copper, it stretches really, really easily. So you might be in a situation like if you're an over hammerer, or depending on the mandrels that you have, you might want to subtract twice the thickness of the sheet metal. And if I subtract 3 times the thickness of the sheet metal, it ends up being way too little. So you might need to practice that one. So the next thing I need to do is I need to cut off this little amount, and then I need to anneal my inside ring. So I just soldered I made the joint and soldered just like we did on our first vessel, and then now I'm going to form the work. Remember to do overlapping blows. Once you've taken it off, put it back on. And then I like to have my vessel sitting right next to me, and so you can already see that that fits perfectly. So that was the diameter minus the thickness of material and then times 3.14, and it's just perfect. I'm going to try to not overhammer, but I'm going to hammer it one more time just for a little spot that's wonky, but it is exactly the size I want. And that looks great. So remember to use a rawhide mallet so that it doesn't overstretch the metal and so it doesn't mar the metal. And then remember to bring your container over to where you're forming so that you don't accidentally overstretch your material. So that's great. So that's ready to solder on to a base or to the top lid. So we have our tension fit piece. And I have it up on cotter pins, so you can see them there, that have some carbon on them. And so that's just making it a perfect environment for that brick to hold the heat. I also have put a little bit of whiteout on my joint. Remember that whiteout is really flammable, but it's going to keep the previous hard solder joint. It's going to help it from melting, and more than anything, it just keeps me where I remember where it is. You can also use yellow ochre for that, or like a stop flow. And then I'm using hard solder again for this joint. Remember to make sure that you have good ventilation. So I'm going to use 2 torches. And I start by preheating. And the preheating is just helping that water from the flux burn off. And then you see that I've come into the inside to get a lot of heat on the inside of the material, because that's where it's going to need the most heat. The solder pallions are on the outside of the right angle joint because I'm going to pull them in using capillary action. So the hottest part of my piece is going to be the inside of the metal. So I need to make sure I get a lot of heat on that bottom sheet because it's really large, and that's so that I can actually have enough for my lid edge. So I'm heating everything really evenly, heating that bottom sheet as much as I possibly can. I haven't really hit the tube with heat at all. You can see it's starting to get hot now, and that heat is just coming up from whenever I was using it. And so I'm really close to going. Again, I've got to get it hot enough, fast enough, so I need to get after it. I've got my heat on the inside edge and on the outside. You can see that the solder is getting ready to flow. And I'm making sure to avoid the butt joint. And all of that looks great. Just double check on this side. Okay, and that looks good. So if you had formed this a lot, you saw I didn't form mine hardly at all. If you had formed that a lot, then I would go ahead and anneal your ring before you solder it so that that doesn't have the tendency to open up. So I've left it for a couple of seconds, take it off the cotter pins and quench. And then I'm gonna pickle and clean my metal. So I have my container with a top on it, my lid, and then I have my container that I created here. So the next step is I made sure that the top was flat. I'm usually doing that with a flat single cut file. And I'm working my way across, and then I usually take it to a sanding board and I sand like that. So so my joint is nice and flat, ready to go. Sometimes I do a little bit of cleanup on the outside. And I'll come back to that. You notice that I didn't file that joint and clean that up that much because I knew that I was going to have a solder joint coming, and I didn't want that to melt while I was doing the next part. So I've got to put my piece in, and I'm going to go ahead and put it all the way in. And then I'm going to cut out the rim. I need to make sure that I keep my saw blade straight up and down so that I still have a lip. Sometimes it might be easier to draw a line again just so that you can see, so that you can stay to the outside of the line. Some people like to take the vessel off. I'm going to leave it on because it keeps me from running into the edge of my box. So same thing as when we took off the other piece. Said I'm going to keep it on, but I might take it off. And I can still see my marker. I'm staying well to the outside of that line so that I can file the edge later. Again, if I'm right-handed, I'm going from the right side. If I'm left-handed, I'm going from the left side. Okay, and that's it. I'm going to leave these apart until I put a handle on because this is going to be really hard to get off with that little thin edge there. So instead of shoving it all the way in now, which I'm always tempted to do, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to leave that off until I build a little handle. I like to do some decorative things here so that I get experience with sweat soldering. So I'm probably going to do something similar where I make like a little dome that I sweat solder on and then a little handle so that it comes off. So that's coming next. So I'm going to show a couple of different ways of sweat soldering. So I have a dome with some flux on it here, and then I have a disc also with some flux on it, and I have some little pallions of hard solder here that I'm going to pick solder onto the dome. So the first thing I do is I just get my dome nice and hot, and then I'm going to come over with my solder poker and ball that up, put it on the edge, ball that up, put it on the edge. And so now that I have those ready, I'm going to take this, and I already have some flux over here. So I'm going to take my dome, place it down, and then I am going to heat from underneath. And then that just dropped down perfect, and the solder flowed all the way around. So now there's a layer of hard solder that is soldered just to the inside edge there. So that worked out great. So next step, I'm gonna set this up like this. I'm gonna put some medium solder pallions here, and then I'm gonna put it onto my container after I've pickled and cleaned it. So I have the dome that we just finished, and I have sanded the brass so it's nice and clean. I put flux in there, and then there's little pallions of medium solder. So I'm going to solder this and get those balled up, and then I'm gonna put it onto my lid, sweat solder it down. So here we go. I'm gonna preheat because I actually have my pallions on the metal. So I have all of those tacked. And I could just see that flux barely kind of shining, and I could see that solder flowing. And I remelted a tiny bit of that hard solder on the top dome, so I know that it went. So then I just have some cleanup. I'm gonna forge a little handle to put on the top of this dome, and then I'll be done.